On the island of Raiatea, roughly 120 miles northwest of Tahiti, there's a stone platform that Polynesians once considered the center of their universe, Marae Taputapuatea. The name translates roughly to sacrifices from abroad. For 1,000 years, navigators from across the Pacific returned here to pay tribute, to learn the stars, and to connect their scattered islands to something larger than themselves. The site sits on a black sand beach, waves breaking just yards from the stone terraces. It's not grand in the way we usually think of ancient monuments. No towering pyramids, no colossal statues. Just precisely fitted basalt slabs arranged in rectangular platforms, some standing upright like sentinels facing the ocean. The largest platform stretches about 130 feet long. Coral rubble fills the gaps between stones. And yet this modest arrangement of rock became the spiritual and political center of an oceanic empire. Construction began sometime around 1000 AD, though the exact date remains disputed. What we know for certain is that by the time Europeans arrived in the 18th century, Marae Taputapuatea had already been abandoned for decades. The knowledge of its full purpose had faded, passed down through oral traditions that grew hazier with each generation. Here's what makes this place remarkable. The Polynesians who built it were master navigators who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses or written charts. They read waves, followed birds, memorized star paths, and they did all of this while maintaining cultural connections across distances that would have isolated any other ancient civilization. Marae Taputapuatea was the hub of that network. Archaeological evidence suggests the site served multiple functions. Religious ceremonies, certainly. Human sacrifices occurred here, though less frequently than Spanish accounts from other Pacific islands might have you believe. Political gatherings brought chiefs together from Hawaii, New Zealand, the Cook Islands. The Marae functioned as a kind of proto-United Nations, a neutral ground where disputes could be settled and alliances forged. But there's another layer that archaeologists are still piecing together: the site's alignment. The main platform faces almost due east, toward the rising sun during the equinox. The upright stones, called patu, mark specific points on the horizon where certain stars appeared at certain times of year. This wasn't accidental. The builders possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and embedded it directly into the architecture. Captain James Cook observed ceremonies here in 1769, though by then the site had already declined in importance. His journals describe elaborate rituals involving priests wrapped in sacred cloth, offerings of pigs and breadfruit, chants that lasted for hours. But Cook also noted that many of the local people seemed unsure about the site's original significance. The institutional knowledge had started to erode. Modern research reveals something even more intriguing. Stone samples from various marae across French Polynesia show that builders transported specific types of basalt over considerable distances. Why go to that effort? The islands had plenty of local stone, unless, of course, the origin of the stone itself held meaning. Perhaps each participating island contributed material from their own shores, physically binding their homeland to this central site. The question of who organized all this remains open. Polynesian society didn't have emperors or pharaohs in the traditional sense. Leadership was complex, based on genealogy, martial skill, and spiritual authority. Yet somehow, they coordinated construction projects, maintained trade routes, and kept this place functioning as a cultural anchor for centuries. When missionaries arrived in the 19th century, they systematically destroyed many marae throughout the Pacific, viewing them as pagan temples that needed to be eradicated. Marae Taputapuatea survived largely intact, possibly because it had already been abandoned. The missionaries had no living tradition to suppress, just stones arranged on a beach. Today, UNESCO recognizes it as a World Heritage Site. Polynesian communities from across the Pacific have begun gathering here again, reviving ceremonies, reconnecting with traditions that were nearly lost. But the full story of what happened here between 1000 and 1800 AD, that's still being written. The stones don't give up their secrets easily. We can measure alignments, carbon date organic material, analyze wear patterns. What we can't do is resurrect the worldview of the people who built this place. We see a platform. They saw the center of everything. And that gap between our understanding and theirs, that's where the real mystery lives. High on the western slopes of Mount Lawu in central Java, there's a temple that doesn't look like any other temple in Indonesia. Candi Sukuh, 1,500 feet above sea level, surrounded by dense forest and terraced farmland, this 15th century structure resembles something you'd expect to find in Central America, not Southeast Asia. Step pyramids, explicit stone carvings, symbols that scholars still argue about, and a construction date that places it right at the end of Java's Hindu-Buddhist period, just as Islam was sweeping across the island. The main pyramid rises about 90 feet at its base, built from rough andesite blocks stacked in receding tiers. The profile is unmistakable. If you showed someone a silhouette without context, they might guess Mayan. But this is Java, and the builders were operating within a completely different cultural framework. Or were they? The Dutch discovered the site in the 19th century, already overgrown and partially collapsed. Early archaeologists assumed it was another Hindu temple, perhaps dedicated to Shiva. Then they started examining the carvings more closely. That's when things got complicated. Sexual imagery covers many of the reliefs, not subtle suggestions, explicit depictions of genitalia, copulation, fertility symbols. One famous stone carving shows a blacksmith forging a phallus on an anvil. Another depicts a woman in a position that left Victorian-era scholars scrambling for euphemisms in their field reports. This wasn't typical temple decoration, not even for tantric traditions that occasionally incorporated sexual symbolism. The site's layout adds another layer of strangeness. 3 terraces rise up the mountainside, connected by steep stone stairways. On the lowest terrace, there's a gateway flanked by 2 stone turtles. Turtles appear throughout Javanese mythology as symbols of the cosmos, the foundation upon which the world rests. But these particular turtles have male genitalia carved prominently on their shells. Hard to explain that one with standard iconographic analysis. Local legends call Candi Sukuh a place of ritual purification, specifically related to metalworking and fertility. Some stories claim blacksmiths came here to be ritually cleansed before forging sacred weapons. Others suggest it was a site where young people underwent initiation ceremonies. The problem is, we don't have written records from this period. The temple was built during a time of massive cultural upheaval. The great Hindu-Buddhist kingdom of Majapahit was fragmenting. Islam was arriving from the north. Whatever traditions centered on Candi Sukuh didn't survive the transition. Carbon dating of organic material found in the temple complex puts construction somewhere between 1437 and 1459 AD. That's remarkably late for a Hindu temple in Java. Most of the great temple building happened centuries earlier. Borobudur was finished by 825 AD, Prambanan by 850 AD, Why would someone build this unusual structure 600 years later using an architectural style that appears nowhere else in the region? Some researchers have proposed that Candi Sukuh represents a last gasp of pre-Islamic tradition, built by a community trying to preserve old practices as the religious landscape shifted. The explicit sexual imagery might have been a deliberate statement, a celebration of beliefs that the arriving Muslim traders would have found objectionable. It's a theory. Can't prove it, but it fits the timeline. Then there's the pyramid itself. Hindu temples in Java typically follow a specific architectural vocabulary. Stupas, towers called candi, concentric galleries with narrative reliefs. They're ornate, detailed, built to last. Candi Sukuh is rougher. The stones are less precisely cut. The proportions are different. It almost looks experimental, like the builders were trying something new, or possibly reviving something very old. That's led a handful of researchers down a more controversial path. What if the pyramid design isn't coincidental? What if there was some kind of ancient contact between Southeast Asia and the Americas? The usual academic response is skepticism, bordering on hostility. No evidence of trans-Pacific voyages during this period. No shared artifacts, no linguistic connections. And yet, there's that pyramid. The Indonesian government has restored parts of the site over the past few decades, replacing fallen stones, clearing vegetation. But restoration always raises questions. How do you know where stones originally sat when you're working from a collapsed ruin? Some archaeologists worry that what tourists see today reflects 20th century assumptions more than 15th century reality. The builders left us a puzzle without instructions. We can describe what we see. What we can't do is explain why they built it this way, what ceremonies took place here, or what message they hoped would survive them. In the Sonoran Desert, about an hour southeast of Phoenix, there's a 4-story mud structure that has baffled visitors since the first Spanish explorers stumbled across it in the 17th century. Casa Grande, the Great House. It stands alone now, protected by a massive metal roof installed in 1932, surrounded by the low mounds and depressions that mark where an entire community once thrived. The Hohokam people built it around 1350 AD, then abandoned it less than a century later. Nobody knows exactly why. The building rises nearly 35 feet from the desert floor, constructed entirely from caliche, a concrete-like mixture of calcium carbonate soil found in the region. The walls at the base are over 4 feet thick. They taper as they rise, but even at the top level, they're still substantial enough to support the weight above. No wooden frame, no stone reinforcement, just layers and layers of mud, shaped by hand, baked hard by the Arizona sun. Stand next to it, and the first question that hits you is simple. Why here? This isn't strategic high ground. There's no natural water source nearby. The Hohokam had to engineer an extensive canal system to bring water from the Gila River miles away. They turned the desert into farmland through sheer determination and hydraulic engineering that rivals anything being done in Europe at the same time. And right in the middle of their agricultural valley, they built this massive structure that seems to serve no obvious practical purpose. The building has 11 rooms, though calling them rooms doesn't quite capture what you see. The spaces inside are small, cramped, with doorways that require you to crouch to enter, not designed for comfortable living. The walls have small openings, windows of a sort, but their placement is peculiar. Several align precisely with the sun's position during solstices and equinoxes. One opening in the upper west wall frames the setting sun on the summer solstice with remarkable accuracy. Father Eusebio Kino documented the ruins in 1694, already abandoned for at least 200 years by then. Local Oodum people, likely descendants of the Hohokam, told him the structure had been built by ancestors they called Huhugum, which translates roughly to those who have gone. They had stories about the place, but no clear explanation for its purpose. The knowledge had slipped away, eroded by time and cultural disruption. Archaeologists have proposed several theories over the years: an astronomical observatory, a ceremonial center, a home for a ruling elite, a defensive position. The problem is that each theory has holes. If it's an observatory, why make it so large? If it's a ceremonial center, where are the associated ritual artifacts? If it's an elite residence, why are the rooms so small and uncomfortable? If it's defensive, why build it in the middle of flat farmland instead of elevated terrain? The Hohokam culture thrived in this desert for over 1,000 years. They developed sophisticated irrigation networks, some canals stretching over 15 miles. They traded with cultures as far south as Mesoamerica, importing shells, copper bells, macaw feathers. Their pottery was distinctive, decorated with red on-buff designs that evolved in style over centuries. They were organized, successful, technologically advanced for their time and place. Then, sometime in the early 1400s, everything collapsed. The population dispersed. The canals fell into disrepair. Villages were abandoned. Casa Grande stood empty, slowly weathering in the desert heat. What happened? Climate data suggests a severe drought hit the region around that time. Tree ring studies show a pattern of reduced rainfall. But the Hohokam had survived droughts before. This one shouldn't have ended their civilization. Some researchers point to social factors. Perhaps the irrigation system created inequalities. Those controlling water access gained power. Resentments built. The society fractured from within. It's happened elsewhere. But again, we're speculating. The Hohokam didn't leave written records. We're reading their story from pottery shards and canal remnants and the enigmatic structure they left standing in the desert. Casa Grande became the first archaeological preserve in the United States, protected by an act of Congress in 1892. Even then, people recognized that this was something worth saving, even if they couldn't fully explain what it was. The metal roof that covers it now protects the caliche walls from rain, which would gradually dissolve them. An ironic solution. Building a modern structure to preserve an ancient one. The Hohokam built an entire civilization here. Casa Grande was just one element, but it's the element that survived. The rest is dust and depression in the ground, and that might be the real mystery. Not why they built this particular structure, but why this one remains when everything else around it crumbled away. In the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, high on a defensible plateau surrounded by peaks and forest, the Dacians built their capital, Sarmizegetusa, Regia, the sacred fortress. 2,000 years ago, this was the center of a kingdom powerful enough to worry Rome. The Emperor Trajan himself led 2 campaigns to conquer it, finally succeeding in 106 AD, after losses so severe that he stopped issuing regular casualty reports. What the Romans found when they finally breached the walls was a city unlike anything they'd seen in the barbarian territories. Stone sanctuaries, paved roads, a massive circular calendar carved into the bedrock. The site sits at about 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only through narrow mountain passes that the Dacians fortified with walls and watchtowers. Natural springs provided water. The surrounding forests offered timber and game. From a defensive standpoint, it was nearly perfect. Roman legions had to haul siege equipment up mountain trails while defenders rained arrows and rocks down from above. The Dacians built in stone, which surprises people. We tend to think of Iron Age European tribes as living in wooden huts, leaving few permanent traces. Not here. The sanctuaries at Sarmizegetusa, Regia, used limestone blocks fitted together with wooden clamps, a technique borrowed from Greek architecture. The largest sanctuary, a rectangular structure about 60 feet by 100 feet, had 6 rows of 6 wooden columns supporting a roof that no longer exists. The stone bases remain, arranged in perfect geometric precision. Then there's the calendar, a circular formation of wooden posts set in stone foundations, arranged in multiple concentric rings. The outer ring had 180 posts. The inner rings followed complex mathematical ratios. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to decode its function. Most agree it tracked solar and lunar cycles, possibly predicting eclipses. Some suggest it was also a ritual space where priests performed ceremonies aligned with celestial events. The Dacians didn't write much down, so we're left interpreting what the stones can tell us. King Decebalus ruled from here during the wars with Rome. The ancient sources describe him as intelligent, ruthless, capable of uniting the fractious Dacian tribes into an effective fighting force. He fortified Sarmizegetusa Regia with multiple defensive walls, some built from massive stone blocks that would have required coordinated labor and engineering expertise. This wasn't a barbarian fort. This was sophisticated military architecture. Roman historians recorded that the Dacians possessed gold mines of enormous wealth. Trajan's motivation for conquest wasn't just territorial expansion. He needed gold to stabilize Rome's economy, to pay the legions, to fund his building projects back in the capital. When the Romans finally took Sarmizegetusa Regia, they plundered an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and 1 million pounds of silver. Those numbers might be exaggerated, but even half that amount would have been staggering. The Dacians knew they were losing. Before the final assault, they hid portions of their treasure in caves and buried caches throughout the mountains. Some of it has been found over the centuries. Most hasn't. Decebalus himself committed suicide rather than be taken alive. The Romans found his body, cut off his head, and sent it back to Rome as a trophy. After the conquest, the Romans built their own city in the lowlands, also called Sarmizegetusa, which became the capital of the new province of Dacia. But the original mountain fortress, they mostly abandoned it. Too remote, too difficult to supply. The stone sanctuaries fell into ruin. The wooden structures rotted away. Forests reclaimed the terraces. Excavations began in the early 20th century and continue sporadically today. What archaeologists have found challenges the Roman narrative of civilized conquerors subduing savages. The Dacians had a complex religion that involved astronomical observation and ritual sacrifice. They produced fine metalwork and pottery. They traded with Greek cities on the Black Sea coast. They had a written language, though only a handful of inscriptions survive, not enough to fully decipher it. One of the strangest findings is evidence of deliberate destruction before the Romans arrived. Some sanctuaries show signs of ritual dismantling, as if the Dacians themselves were taking apart their sacred spaces rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Certain artifacts appear to have been intentionally broken and buried. This wasn't the chaos of defeat. This was organized, purposeful. The Romans wrote the history, They portrayed the Dacians as worthy adversaries, dangerous and cunning, but ultimately inferior to Roman civilization. Walking through Sarmizegetusa Regia suggests a different story. In the heart of Sri Lanka, rising nearly 600 feet straight up from the surrounding jungle, there's a column of stone that shouldn't have a palace on top of it. Sigiriya, Lion Rock. In the 5th century AD, a king named Kashyapa built his capital on this geological anomaly, constructing gardens, fortifications, and a royal residence in a location that defies every practical consideration. He ruled for 18 years from this isolated summit, then lost everything in a single day of battle. The ruins he left behind have puzzled architects and historians ever since. The rock itself is ancient volcanic magma, hardened and exposed after millions of years of erosion wore away the softer stone around it. From a distance, it dominates the landscape, a massive, rust-colored monolith that catches the light at sunset and glows like it's burning from within. The jungle crowds close, but the rock stands clear, impossible to miss. Kashyapa came to power through patricide. He killed his father, King Datusena, and seized the throne from his half-brother Moggallana, the legitimate heir. Moggallana fled to India, and Kashyapa, knowing his brother would return with an army, decided he needed a fortress that couldn't be taken. So he chose Sigiriya. Not a hill that could be fortified, not a strategic river valley, a vertical rock face in the middle of nowhere. The engineering required to build up there staggers the imagination. Every stone, every brick, every drop of water had to be carried up staircases carved into the rock. The workers built a gateway at the base, shaped like a gigantic lion, its paws still visible today. Visitors would climb through the lion's mouth to reach the upper levels. The symbolism was clear. Kashyapa was untouchable, protected by stone and height and the fierce reputation he was cultivating. But here's where it gets interesting. Kashyapa didn't just build a fortress, he built a pleasure palace. The summit had a swimming pool fed by a sophisticated hydraulic system that still functions during monsoon season. Gardens covered the lower terraces, laid out in geometric patterns with water channels and fountains. The rock face itself was painted with massive frescoes of women, hundreds of them, only 22 of which survive. These aren't religious figures or queens. They're sensual, bare-breasted, adorned with jewelry, painted in colors that have somehow lasted 1,500 years. The water system is what really catches engineers' attention. The Sinhalese had developed hydraulic technology that rivals Roman aqueducts. Underground pipes, cisterns, pressure valves, gravity-fed distribution networks. During the monsoon, water would cascade down the rock in controlled channels, feeding the gardens and pools, creating a spectacle of falling water in the middle of the dry zone. In a region where water meant survival, this was the ultimate display of power. Kashyapa could make water flow uphill. The gardens below the rock follow a plan that predates European formal gardens by 1,000 years. Symmetrical layouts, raised beds, water features designed to reflect the rock itself. Archaeologists have identified them as some of the oldest landscaped gardens in the world, which raises a question. Why put this much effort into aesthetics when you're supposedly building a defensive position? Some scholars argue that Kashyapa wasn't primarily thinking about defense. He was making a statement. This was a religious site before he claimed it, a Buddhist monastery that had existed for centuries. By building his palace here, Kashyapa was positioning himself as semi-divine, above both his subjects and the monks who had previously occupied the rock. The frescoes might represent celestial beings, apsaras from Hindu-Buddhist mythology. The entire complex might have been designed as a symbolic representation of cosmic geography, with Kashyapa at the center. If that was the plan, it failed. Moggallana returned in 495 AD with an army from the southern India. The two brothers met in battle on the plains below Sigiriya. Kashyapa, seeing himself outflanked, either fell from his elephant or deliberately dismounted, depending on which chronicle you read. Either way, he died on the field. His army scattered. The fortress was abandoned. Monks returned to Sigiriya and used it as a monastery for another 1,000 years. They added inscriptions to the mirror wall, a polished surface where visitors left graffiti poems, some of which still survive. These verses are surprisingly personal, talking about the beauty of the paintings, the impressiveness of the fortress, the emotions the place inspired. By the 14th century, even the monks had left. The jungle moved in. The ruins of the palace cover the summit, just foundations mostly, enough to trace where rooms once stood. The wind blows steady up here, and you're left wondering what Kashyapa thought about during those 18 years. On Mount Bouvray in central France, about 200 miles southeast of Paris, there's a hill fort that witnessed one of the most significant moments in European history. Bibracte, capital of the Aedui tribe. In 52 BC, this was where Vercingetorix was proclaimed supreme commander of the Gallic forces uniting against Julius Caesar. The decision made here led to the last great Celtic uprising, a war that ended with Gaul under Roman control and Celtic culture pushed to the margins of Europe. The settlement covered over 300 acres at its peak, protected by massive stone walls that enclosed workshops, temples, homes, and a political center that nearly changed the course of Western civilization. The Aedui were one of the most powerful Gallic tribes, wealthy from trade and mining, sophisticated enough to mint their own coins and maintain diplomatic relations with Rome. They built Bibracte on a mountain that rises about 2,700 feet above sea level, dominating the surrounding landscape. This wasn't a rough wooden stockade. The fortifications used a technique the Romans called murus gallicus, Gallic wall, timber framework filled with earth and stone, faced with dressed blocks, reinforced with iron spikes, driven horizontally through the structure. When Caesar later described these walls in his accounts of the Gallic Wars, he did so with a mixture of admiration and unease. The archaeology tells us this was an urban center by any reasonable definition. Organized streets laid out in a grid pattern, specialized craft quarters where metalworkers produced tools, weapons, jewelry, a marketplace where merchants traded goods from across Europe and the Mediterranean, amphorae from Italy, glass beads from Egypt, coral from the coast. The Aedui weren't isolated barbarians. They were integrated into trade networks that stretched from Britain to North Africa. But here's what makes Bibracte particularly significant. When the various Gallic tribes met here in 52 BC, they were making a choice that went against decades of precedent. The Aedui had been Roman allies. They'd supported Caesar in his earlier campaigns. But watching Roman power expand into territories that had been Gallic for centuries, watching Roman governors extract tribute and impose laws, something shifted. Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverni tribe, managed to convince them that alliance with Rome was just a slower form of conquest. The meeting itself left no archaeological trace, no building where we can say this is where it happened. But Caesar's own writings confirm Bibracte as the location where the tribes gathered. where they handed war leadership to Vercingetorix, where they committed to a unified resistance. It was probably the largest gathering of Celtic political power in recorded history. What followed was brutal. Vercingetorix proved to be a capable military leader, using scorched earth tactics and guerrilla warfare to harass Roman supply lines. He won battles, but Caesar was relentless, methodical, willing to besiege fortified positions until defenders starved. The rebellion ended at Alesia, another hill fort about 50 miles northeast of Bibracte, where Vercingetorix surrendered to save his men from complete annihilation. Caesar kept him prisoner for 6 years, then had him strangled as part of a triumph ceremony in Rome. After the conquest, something unexpected happened. The Aedui abandoned Bibracte and built a new city in the valley below, a Roman-style settlement called Augustodunum, modern Autumn. Within a generation, the hill fort was mostly empty. People took building materials from the old walls to construct new homes in the lowlands. The workshops closed. The temples fell into disrepair. The choice to move wasn't forced by Rome. It was voluntary, a decision by the Aedui themselves to embrace Roman culture, Roman architecture, Roman ways of organizing urban space. Excavations began in the 19th century under Napoleon III, who had a romantic fascination with Celtic history. French archaeologists have been working the site systematically ever since, uncovering evidence that challenges simple narratives about Roman civilization and barbarian resistance. The Celts at Bibracte were producing high-quality goods, following architectural plans, managing complex economic systems. The Romans didn't bring civilization to Gaul. They brought a different kind of civilization, one that eventually absorbed and replaced what was already there. The site is partially reconstructed, with ancient streets, foundations, and the Murus Gallicus visible. A museum and research center continue excavations, uncovering new artifacts and insights each summer. The walls remain, marking decisions that shaped European history, but the people, their language, and culture are mostly lost. Rome prevailed, recording the story in Latin, leaving Bibracte as a historical footnote. On the Pacific slope of Guatemala, where the highlands descend toward coastal lowlands, there's a site that captures a moment of transformation in Mesoamerican history. Takalik Abaj, Standing Stones. For over 1,000 years, this was a major ceremonial and trading center, occupied from about 800 BC until 200 AD. What makes it extraordinary isn't just its age or size. It's that the site preserves evidence of the transition from Olmec to Maya civilization, a cultural shift that happened gradually, mysteriously, in ways we're still trying to understand. The stone monuments here include both Olmec-style sculptures and early Maya hieroglyphic texts, sometimes on the same terrace, as if two different worldviews were negotiating their relationship in stone. The site covers roughly 15 acres of cleared and excavated area, though ground-penetrating radar suggests the ancient settlement extended much farther. Multiple ceremonial platforms rise in terraces, connected by stairways and plazas. What catches your eye immediately are the stone monuments. Over 280 sculptures have been catalogued, many still in their original positions. Some are massive carved heads in the Olmec style, round-faced figures with distinctive downturned mouths. Others are stelae, covered with early Maya glyphs and calendar notations. They coexist in the same architectural spaces. The Olmec influence is unmistakable. By 800 BC, Olmec culture from the Gulf Coast lowlands had spread across Mesoamerica through trade routes and cultural exchange. Their artistic style, their religious symbolism, their obsession with jade and ritual bloodletting all appear at Takalik Abaj. But something happened here around 400 BC. The purely Olmec style began to change. Local variations emerged. New gods appeared in the iconography. The writing system that would become Maya hieroglyphics started to develop. One monument in particular tells this story. Stela 5 shows a figure in Olmec regalia but includes hieroglyphic text that's definitively Maya, including a long count calendar date that corresponds to 126 AD. Whoever carved this was working in a tradition that bridged both cultures, someone for whom Olmec and Maya weren't separate categories but parts of a continuous evolution. The alignments themselves are what give the site its modern name. Rows of standing stones mark specific sight lines across the landscape. Some align with the sunrise on solstice mornings. Others point toward distant mountain peaks that held sacred significance. The Maya were obsessed with astronomical observation, tracking Venus with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. At Takalik Abaj, you can see the early development of that obsession, stone markers placed with intention, creating a calendar written into the geography itself. Trade goods found at the site indicate connections across vast distances. Obsidian from highland sources over 100 miles away, jade from the Motagua Valley, marine shells from the Pacific coast. Cacao, which grows well in this climate, may have been a major export. The Maya used cacao beans as currency and in ritual drinks. Evidence suggests the practice started earlier, possibly here, during the transition period when Takalik Abaj functioned as a major exchange point between highlands and lowlands. Excavations have uncovered elaborate burial sites beneath some of the platforms. Elite individuals interred with jade jewelry, ceramic vessels, stingray spines, used in bloodletting rituals. One tomb contained over 600 jade ornaments, an incredible concentration of wealth. The Maya believed jade was more valuable than gold, associated with life force, breath, the essence of being. To be buried with that much jade suggested immense political and spiritual power. But here's the puzzle. Around 200 AD, the site was largely abandoned, not destroyed, not conquered, just gradually emptied out as people moved elsewhere. The reason isn't clear. Climate data doesn't show major droughts during this period. There's no evidence of warfare or epidemic disease. Trade routes may have shifted. Political power may have consolidated at other centers. Whatever the cause, Takalik Abaj lost its importance and became overgrown by jungle. Local people knew about the site for centuries. Some monuments remained visible, incorporated into folk traditions that had forgotten their original meaning. Systematic archaeology didn't begin until the 1960s, and work continues today. Guatemalan archaeologists have been particularly focused on understanding the Olmec Maya transition, using Takalik Abaj as a key site for that research. Most of the ancient city remains under forest and farmland, with visible monuments in maintained plazas, some under shelters. Monument 23, a massive carved head, still shows traces of red pigment applied 2,000 years ago. In the eastern foothills of the Bolivian Andes, about 75 miles southwest of Santa Cruz, there's a sandstone outcrop covered with carvings that nobody can fully explain. El Fuerte de Samaipata, the fort at Samaipata. Except it's not a fort, despite the name. It's a massive piece of bedrock, about 800 feet long, carved with geometric channels, niches, circular depressions, and symbolic figures that suggest religious purpose more than military function. Multiple cultures worked this stone over more than 1,000 years. The earliest carvings might date back to 300 AD. The Inca modified it in the 15th century, and between those periods, someone else was here, creating features that don't fit comfortably into any known cultural pattern. The rock sits at about 6,400 feet elevation, high enough to catch clouds that drift up from the Amazon basin to the east. The climate is transitional, not quite highland, not quite lowland. Humid, but not oppressive. The location sits at a crossroads between the Andean civilizations to the west and the lowland cultures of the Amazon drainage. Trade routes passed through here. Ideas moved along those routes. And at some point, people decided this particular piece of exposed sandstone was sacred enough to spend generations carving. The most striking feature is what archaeologists call the ceremonial platform, a flat area at the highest point of the rock where two parallel channels have been cut, each about 60 feet long and several feet deep. The channels are too large to be practical drainage, too precisely parallel to be accidental. They point roughly east-west, which suggests solar alignment, though the exact purpose remains debated. At the eastern end of these channels, there are carved niches and seats, places where individuals could sit facing the rising sun. Surrounding these main channels are dozens of smaller features, circular depressions arranged in geometric patterns, triangular niches cut into vertical faces, representations of felines, possibly jaguars or pumas, though erosion has worn them down enough that identification requires some interpretation. The Inca added their own touches later, carving trapezoidal niches in their distinctive style, but the underlying work predates them by centuries. The real mystery involves a series of circular basins and connecting channels that cover one section of the rock. They're clearly artificial, cut with precision into the sandstone. Some archaeologists have suggested they're a model of something, perhaps an astronomical map or a representation of a river system. Others think they're ritual features, where liquids, maybe water or chicha beer, would be poured and channeled in ceremonial contexts. Without written records, we're guessing based on form and position. Spanish chronicles mention the site briefly in the 16th century, describing it as an important indigenous religious center that the Inca had incorporated into their empire. By the time the Spanish arrived, the site was already being abandoned. Local populations had been devastated by European diseases that spread faster than the conquistadors themselves. The knowledge of what ceremonies occurred here, what the carvings meant, died with the people who maintained those traditions. What complicates interpretation is that the rock shows evidence of multiple construction phases with different tool technologies. Some carvings are weathered and ancient. Others are sharper, clearly more recent. The Inca additions are identifiable by style and technique, but there are features that don't match Inca work or the styles of other known Andean cultures. Whoever made those was operating with their own aesthetic and symbolic vocabulary. The Spanish called it a fort because there are defensive walls below the rock, stone structures that date to the Inca period. The Inca did use the site strategically, placing it along their road system that connected the highlands to the eastern frontier. But the carved rock itself isn't defensive. You can't hold territory with ceremonial channels. The military and religious functions seem to have coexisted, with the religious aspect being much older. Modern archaeology at Samaipata has revealed residential areas, agricultural terraces, and water management systems in the surrounding landscape. This was a functioning community, not just a ritual site, visited occasionally. People lived here, farmed here, raised families. The carved rock was integrated into daily life, a constant presence in the landscape that shaped how the community understood its relationship to the cosmos. And you're left with the weight of everything we don't know. Who first decided this rock was special? What stories did they tell about it? What did they believe would happen when liquid flowed through those channels? The stone holds the questions, the answers left with the people who carved it. In the highlands of central Peru, near the modern city of Huánuco, there's a temple complex that predates pottery in the region, Kotosh. The name comes from Quechua, meaning pile of stones or heap, which hardly does justice to what archaeologists found when they began excavating in the 1960s. This site was occupied from around 2500 BC to roughly 200 BC, making it one of the oldest ceremonial centers in the Americas. The most famous structure, the Temple of the Crossed Hands, contains a pair of sculpted hands emerging from the walls, positioned one above the other in a crossed pattern. They've become iconic in Peruvian archaeology. What they meant to the people who made them is another matter entirely. The temple sits on the eastern slope of the Andes at about 6,500 feet elevation in the headwaters of the Huallaga River drainage. This is Montaña country, where the mountains begin their descent toward the Amazon. The climate is milder than the high Puna to the west, with enough rainfall to support agriculture. The people living here 3,000 years ago were cultivating beans, squash, chili peppers. They hadn't yet developed ceramics, which makes dating their occupation tricky, but radiocarbon analysis of organic material gives us a timeline. The Temple of the Crossed Hands measures roughly 30 feet square, built from river cobbles and mud mortar. The walls were originally plastered with clay and painted. A central fireplace sits in the middle of the floor, surrounded by a low bench. This wasn't a domestic hearth. Analysis of the ash and carbon residue shows that what burned here wasn't cooking fires, but offerings, plant materials, and possibly animal fats burned in ritual contexts. The crossed hands are sculpted in clay, molded onto the walls beneath two small niches. One hand is right, one is left. They're positioned so they appear to be reaching across toward each other, fingers slightly curved. The detail is remarkable, considering the age. You can see fingernails, the curve of knuckles, the natural gesture of relaxed hands. Whoever sculpted these understood human anatomy and had the skill to render it convincingly. What did they symbolize? The obvious interpretation is that they represent prayer or supplication, hands positioned as if in offering or meditation. Some researchers have suggested they represent duality, a concept that appears throughout Andean cosmology. Day and night, male and female, upper world and lower world. The crossed hands might be expressing that fundamental balance, the intersection of opposing forces. But there's another possibility that's less often discussed. The temple itself appears to have been deliberately buried at some point, not destroyed, not abandoned due to decay, carefully filled in with clean soil and sealed, then built over with a new structure. This is called ritual termination, and it appears at sites throughout ancient Peru. When a temple reached the end of its sacred life, it was respectfully closed, entombed, and replaced. The crossed hands were buried with the rest of the structure, hidden from view for roughly 4,000 years. Why terminate a temple? The Andean peoples who followed this practice seemed to believe that sacred spaces accumulated power over time, but could also become dangerous or exhausted. Renewal required burial and reconstruction. At Kotosh, multiple building phases are stacked one on top of another, each layer representing a generation of religious activity, each previous layer carefully preserved beneath new construction. Excavations revealed other temples at the site, all following similar architectural patterns. Small square or rectangular rooms, central hearths, ventilation shafts that created updrafts, drawing smoke upward. These weren't public spaces. The rooms are too small for congregations. More likely, they were places where priests or shamans performed rituals for the benefit of the larger community, working in private, mediating between the human and spiritual realms. The people of Kotosh were part of a broader tradition called the Kotosh religious tradition, which spread across the central Peruvian highlands during the pre-ceramic period. Similar temple structures with central fire pits and ventilation systems appear at other sites over a wide geographic area. This suggests shared religious beliefs, possibly a network of ceremonial centers that functioned within the same symbolic framework. Around 1200 BC, something changed. Pottery appears in the archaeological record. The architectural style shifts. The old temples were buried and not replaced. By 200 BC, Kotosh was largely abandoned, its temples buried under accumulated soil and vegetation. And we're left trying to translate a gesture made by people who had no writing, whose language is lost, whose beliefs we can only infer from the structures they built, and then carefully, deliberately buried for reasons we can only guess at. In western Tajikistan, near the border with Uzbekistan, there's an archaeological site that rewrites our understanding of when Central Asian civilization began. Sarazm. The name translates to where the land begins, and for the people living here 5,000 years ago, maybe it did. This was a proto-urban settlement, occupied from approximately 3,500 to 2000 BC, during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. At its peak, Sarazm covered over 100 acres, with specialized craft quarters, monumental architecture, and trade connections stretching from the Iranian plateau to the steppes of Kazakhstan. It's one of the oldest cities in Central Asia, and most people have never heard of it. The site sits in the Zeravshan River Valley, a green corridor cutting through otherwise arid terrain. The river provided water for irrigation, turning the valley into productive farmland. The surrounding mountains held resources that would have seemed miraculous to ancient peoples: copper ore, tin, turquoise, silver, lead. The combination of agricultural surplus and mineral wealth created conditions for settlement on a scale that hadn't been seen in this region before. A local farmer discovered the site in 1976, noticing pottery fragments and stone tools eroding out of a riverbank. Soviet archaeologists began excavations shortly after, work that's continued intermittently ever since. What they found challenged the prevailing narrative that civilization in Central Asia was imported from elsewhere, borrowed from Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. Sarazm developed its own urban character, its own architectural traditions, its own solutions to the problems of organizing large populations. The architectural remains show sophisticated planning. Buildings were constructed from mud brick, some with stone foundations. Interior walls were plastered and occasionally painted with red ochre. Room layouts suggest specialized functions: storage areas with large ceramic vessels, workshops where craftsmen worked copper and bronze, using techniques that required temperatures over 1,000 degrees. Evidence of metallurgy, this advanced in the 4th millennium BC, puts Sarazm among the earliest metalworking centers anywhere. One structure, in particular, stands out. Palace number 1, as archaeologists labeled it, covers nearly 15,000 square feet. Multiple rooms arranged around courtyards, thick walls that would have supported a second story, drainage systems beneath the floors. This wasn't a simple dwelling. This was a building designed to impress, to demonstrate wealth and organizational capability. Someone with authority lived here, someone who controlled resources and labor. The burials tell us about social stratification. Some graves contain simple pottery and personal ornaments. Others are filled with luxury goods, turquoise beads by the hundreds, silver and gold jewelry, carved stone vessels, copper axes, and daggers. The people buried with these items weren't just wealthy. They had access to trade networks that brought materials from hundreds of miles away. The turquoise likely came from mines in the Kizilkum Desert, the lapis lazuli from northeastern Afghanistan, the shell beads from the Indian Ocean coast. What's striking is the timeline. Sarazm was thriving while the pyramids were being built in Egypt, while the early Minoan civilization was developing on Crete, while cities in the Indus Valley were reaching their peak. Central Asia wasn't a backwater. It was part of the interconnected Bronze Age world, producing copper and tin that fed the growing demand for bronze across Eurasia. The metallurgical evidence is particularly important. Archaeologists have found crucibles, slag heaps, copper ingots, finished tools, and weapons. Analysis of the metal shows that smiths at Sarazm were producing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, which requires both materials and the knowledge to combine them properly. Tin sources in Central Asia were rare and valuable. Control of tin meant control of bronze production, which meant military and economic power. Around 2000 BC, Sarazm was abandoned without signs of warfare or disaster. Environmental changes, shifting trade routes, or the rise of bronze centers near the Altai Mountains may have caused its decline. Today, the Tajik government preserves the site with shelters and a small museum, and UNESCO recognized it as a World Heritage Site in 2010, though much remains unexcavated under farmland. Mud brick walls, foundations of bronze smiths and farmers' buildings, and the nearby Zaravshan River reveal an ancient, urban life. Sarazm shows that civilization develops through connected ideas and trade, yet for reasons still debated, its people eventually left, letting new cultures rise later in the same land. In West Lothian, Scotland, about 15 miles west of Edinburgh, there's a hilltop that humans have considered sacred for over 5,000 years. Cairnpapple Hill. The name comes from Gaelic, possibly meaning Hill of the Tent or Hill of the Stallion, though the etymology is disputed and probably irrelevant. What matters is that from roughly 3,500 BC until the early medieval period, people kept coming back to this spot, building and rebuilding, burying their dead, marking the landscape with stones and earthworks that suggest deep continuity of belief across cultures that otherwise left little in common. The hill rises about 1,000 feet above sea level, modest by most standards, but in the relatively flat terrain of central Scotland, it commands impressive views. On clear days, you can see the Firth of Forth to the north, the Pentland Hills to the south, Edinburgh to the east. For ancient peoples navigating by landmarks, this would have been an obvious reference point, visible for miles in every direction. The earliest activity here dates to the Neolithic period, around 3,500 BC. People dug a circular ditch and raised a bank, creating what archaeologists call a henge monument. Inside this enclosure, they erected a circle of standing stones, 24 in all, arranged in an oval pattern about 50 feet across. These weren't massive stones like Stonehenge. Most were between 3 and 5 feet tall. But the effort to transport them, set them upright, align them with purpose, that represented significant communal labor. What were they for? The standard answer is astronomical observation and ritual activity, which is vague enough to be almost meaningless but probably essentially correct. The stones mark sight lines toward significant positions of the sun and moon. Whoever placed them understood celestial mechanics well enough to predict seasonal events. Why that mattered enough to justify the work is the real question. Agricultural societies needed to track seasons for planting, but a stone circle seems excessive for a farming calendar. Around 2000 BC, during the Bronze Age, someone decided to repurpose the site. They dismantled some of the standing stones and built burial cairns inside the circle. These weren't simple graves. The cairns were substantial structures, piles of stone covering burial chambers that held cremated remains, pottery vessels, bone tools, occasionally bronze objects. The burials continued over several centuries, each generation adding to the accumulated mass of stone and earth. One burial in particular caught archaeologists' attention. A stone cist containing 2 beaker vessels, a distinctive type of pottery associated with a cultural movement that spread across Europe around 2500 BC. The so-called beaker people, named for their characteristic drinking vessels, appeared throughout Britain, sometimes replacing earlier populations, sometimes intermarrying with them. Their presence at Cairnpapple suggests this hilltop remained important even as the population changed. By the Iron Age, around 500 BC, the site's function shifted again. Someone built ramparts and ditches, fortifying the hilltop, turning a ritual center into a defensive position. These modifications weren't extensive, nothing like the massive hill forts found in southern England, but they indicate that practical military concerns had superseded, or at least supplemented, the site's religious significance. Here's what makes Cairnpapple particularly interesting from an archaeological perspective. The site preserves evidence of continuous ritual activity across 3,000 years, spanning the transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age to Iron Age. Each culture that occupied Scotland during this period left traces here, building on what came before, respecting or repurposing earlier structures. That kind of continuity is rare. Most sacred sites get abandoned, destroyed, or so thoroughly rebuilt that earlier phases are obliterated. The Romans probably knew about Cairnpapple. They built the Antonine Wall just a few miles to the north, and Roman surveyors would have noted prominent hilltops when mapping the territory. But there's no evidence of Roman activity at the site itself. Perhaps it was still important to the local Britons, and the Romans avoided it for diplomatic reasons. Or maybe by the 2nd century AD, the hill's sacred status had finally faded. Early medieval burials from around 400 to 600 AD represent the last significant activity. Christian graves, simple inhumations without the elaborate cairns of earlier periods. Then nothing. The hilltop was abandoned to farmers who eventually ploughed up the remaining earthworks and removed stones to build field walls. Whatever drew people here 5,000 years ago, that quality of place, it's still palpable. Something about elevation, about seeing far in all directions, about feeling exposed to sky and weather. We've traced a path from Polynesian navigators to Mycenaean engineers, from Dacian resistance to Andean metalworkers. Different solutions to similar problems, different expressions of the same human need to build, to mark territory, to connect earth and sky, to leave something permanent in a temporary world. The questions remain. How much knowledge has been lost? What techniques did they use that we've forgotten? What motivated people to invest generations of labor into structures that served purposes we can barely reconstruct? These aren't just archaeological sites. They're evidence that our ancestors were more capable, more connected, more sophisticated than the simple narratives we've been taught. And there are hundreds more sites like these, still waiting, still holding secrets. If you want to see where we go next, hit that subscribe button. There's more to uncover, more mysteries that deserve attention, more stories that need telling. This is just the beginning.